First of all, welcome to our summer conference dedicated to safety and to the families. And we've got a lot of families here that we saw come in last night. Our operating boards make every attempt to bring whatever current events that we've got in the state that we think is going to be the most interest and the most educational to our elected officials in the courthouses across the state. It appears now, based on our initial registration, this may be the largest conference that we've ever had. So I want to congratulate everybody that this is the place to be this morning. It's a safety conference, and tragically, if you came down I-35 this morning, they had a horrible truck accident at the bridge right at the Tecumseh exit, and I know some people got held up. But anyway, we're going to jump right into it. We've got some really distinguished guests this morning that is going to share a tremendous amount of knowledge with us, and I'm sure each and every one of them, as we complete this with our time frame, if you've got a specific question to them, you might ask at the conclusion of our forum this morning. The agenda for this conference is drop, rock, and roll, and that's the fun part of being at the conference. I think that from past conferences we've learned that by having the families engaged in our safety conference, mother and children seem to have a lot of effect on their fathers and their mothers who work out in the workplace in some of these dangerous locations. But what we're going to start with this morning is a current event that's affected virtually the state of Oklahoma. And for the new commissioners, that maybe this is their first one, or for the seasoned commissioner, that maybe this is the upteenth one, there's nothing quite as tragic as having a disaster declaration in your county. It affects your whole county, it affects your economy, it tragically affects families, and in many cases affects your own family. And you, as a decision maker in the courthouse, have to make, you have to perform, and you have to make some real tough decisions on what you can and can't do. Going ladies first this morning, she needs no introduction, but she is virtually a rock star in county government since the first day we met her. But I'd like to introduce to you on my left and your right, Cindy Byrd, who is our state auditor and inspector for the state of Oklahoma. Thank you. Cindy is not just another elected official in the state of Oklahoma, I can assure you. She comes to her office with 20 years of governmental accounting experience. She and her husband, Steve, are proud residents of Cole County, Oklahoma, and still have their home there. So they're well-grounded in county government. She is the first elected state auditor and inspector for the state of Oklahoma. And she is the 13th auditor and inspector that's ever been elected in the state of Oklahoma, and actually set a kind of a state milestone in the fact she got over 800,000 votes in her election cycle. So she's not only popular with this group, but she's extremely popular across the state of Oklahoma. And we're very, very proud to have you here this morning, Cindy. Thank you.
Thank you, Gene.
Our next guest represents the Federal Emergency Management Agency that's based out of Denton, Texas. She lives there. She comes from many, many years of working within disaster declarations across the United States. She is actually the Recovery Division Director for FEMA 6, which comprises of 6 counties or 7 states?
5 states.
5 states, okay. We will get into that. She's a graduate of Washington University, and she virtually has dedicated her life to disaster declarations and helping people across our great country. Our third guest this morning is Alden Graybill, who many of you know within the state of Oklahoma. He has been with the State Emergency Management Division of OEM for 11 years. He had a proud start as an intern for the Stillwater Emergency Management Group out of Payne County in Oklahoma. So he is well grounded. He lives in Oklahoma City. So we're very, very proud to have him here this morning. So what I'd like to do is start with what happens the day the disaster occurs and kind of lead us through a quick synopsis as to which every office is directed and has responsibility for, and then we will wrap it up with what the requirements are in order to keep you straight as far as Cindy is concerned, and what we all strive to do and make sure we account for every dollar we spend and make it very transparent across the state. So Alden, I'm sorry, we're going to start with you. The disaster happened last night. You got the call at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
Tell us what you did at 7:30 or 6:30 when you got to the office and made the decision as to what you were going to do in the state of Oklahoma.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. So the first thing, most of you are lucky that you have an emergency manager in your jurisdiction. So that's going to be the first person that you call, or they'll probably be the first person that'll be calling you, giving you an update on what's happened in the community or in your jurisdiction. And they're going to help you take the lead on the disaster recovery and response process. The first thing you'll want to focus on is life safety and the protection of property. So depending on what the incident is, you're going to want to look at your community members, the people that live in your community. What are their needs? Because they're going to have a lot of them, depending if it's a tornado or an ice storm or a wildfire. They may have to evacuate. But once you stabilize life safety and protection of property, you'll want to conduct a windshield assessment. Your local emergency manager will help you with this. They'll drive the roads, they'll drive the community, and they'll start counting how many homes have been damaged by the disaster and to what severity. The same is true for roads and public infrastructure. They'll start taking an inventory of what has been damaged. For us to request federal assistance, it starts locally. We have a statewide indicator for public assistance. It's about $6 million. So the state has to show to FEMA, to the president, that our state has been damaged about that amount of money before we can ask for federal assistance. And it all starts with that windshield assessment. The state has an indicator for public assistance, and so does the county. Each county's indicator is based on its population, and it changes every year just a little bit. So that's for public assistance. For individual assistance, it's a little bit more vague. They look for the severity of the damage to the homes, and then what that severity looks like to the community as a whole. And I know Traci will probably talk about that a little bit more in detail. So once we have an idea of what the damages are in the community and across the state, we'll talk with Region 6 at FEMA with Traci, and we'll say, hey, we need to do a joint preliminary damage assessment. And joint meaning that it'll have a local representative, a state representative, and a federal representative on that team to come in and validate the damage that you've identified in your windshield assessment. And I think that's a good transition to turn it over to Traci to talk about the federal joint PDA, state, local.
Well, one additional question.
Okay.
Who does the windshield surveys, and do you have the actual formula as to what triggers a disaster declaration? You have to meet a specific threshold in every county in order for it to be considered, correct?
That is correct.
Do you do that, or does she do that?
Well, it's predetermined. Every year, the county indicator is about $3.70 some times the population of that county. So each county has a different indicator that they have to meet for public assistance. The folks that do the windshield assessment or the damage assessment locally is driven locally. So it could be the county commissioners, could be the city managers, could be the emergency managers on their own. It really kind of depends on how you identify what your process is going to be by doing the damage assessment.
Okay, $3.70 per ad valorem value within a county, is that correct?
I think it's $3.78 times the population.
When this body has an occurrence, everything needs to be counted or estimated when you talk about public property, you're talking about public infrastructure, is that correct? And buildings.
Correct.
Not private, but public.
That's correct.
Okay, and so whether it's road impact, whether it's building impact, whether it's bridge impact, anything that the public owns, that's taxpayer owned, should be considered in that.
That's correct.
Okay, now that $3.78 per ad valorem value in a county, are you able to combine that with municipal damage in order to reach the threshold?
It's a county indicator, and it's $3.78 times the number of people you have in the county, according to the last census. And I believe the last census was 2010.
Okay, now I said ad valorem, you're talking about population.
I'm talking about population, yes.
Okay, so you've done your windshield surveys. The local elected officials have done their surveys, and they have gotten an estimate to you. Now, who runs the windshield survey, you or the elected official?
It'd be the local community in partnership with us. Our department has area coordinators or regional coordinators that we've assigned to 5 quadrants of the state, and it's their job to build relationships locally with the emergency managers, the elected officials, and the county officials and municipal officials, so that when you do have an incident in your community, you have someone from our department that has already built a relationship with you so that you can call and ask questions, and if they're available, they can come help conduct the windshield assessment.
Okay, now there are 3 distinct districts of county commissioner districts in a county. If 1 district or 2 districts are approved, that means the whole county is approved, is that correct?
Correct. FEMA declares by county, not by district, and that holds true throughout the entire process.
Okay, so, and then I guess the last rule of thumb, if you have any thought whatsoever that you have damage, estimate it.
Please.
Okay. Would you recommend they take pictures at that time?
Yes, pictures with GPS points, both starting and ending GPS points for road damage, or do your best to estimate where the home is on the property. A lot of our rural communities, which the state of Oklahoma is mostly rural, these homes are located on a large piece of land, so it's very helpful in the initial damage assessment that we have an idea where the home is, so that when we do bring our federal partners in, we can get the PDA done as quickly as possible.
Okay, when on the $3.78, does federal property damage, is that calculated in the formula also?
No.
Okay. All right, a lot of the roads are divided into what's called minor and major collectors.
Correct.
And the major collectors come under the Federal Highway Administration, which is separate from FEMA. Are those roads calculated during the initial windshield survey that commissioners would go out and run?
No, they are not. If it can be covered by another federal program, like the FHWA program, then FEMA has very limited ability to reimburse any of those damages.
Okay. They ought to note it in order to make the estimate, but they make it to a separate agency and like Federal Highway Administration.
Correct. And we work with ODOT very closely to whenever we have a disaster, so that when they're conducting their FHWA damage assessments and we're out with FEMA conducting FEMA damage assessments, we try to coordinate on those major collectors. And ODOT has a lot of great resources that they give to the counties and the municipalities across the state to help identify what those major minor collectors are.
Okay, so now we've gotten to the point where we're going to submit it. Do you submit that directly to FEMA in Denton, Texas, or does it go to the governor's office? Tell us how that process is completed.
Well, it is the governor that makes the request for a presidential declaration, and he makes it to the president through the regional administrator for whichever region the governor or the state's in. So in our particular case, we're in Region 6 for FEMA. That's 5 states. It's Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, and New Mexico. And our FEMA regional administrator, his name's Tony Robinson. We're very lucky to have him. He's a career FEMA administrator. Some of the FEMA regions have political appointees, which can mess with some of the long-term relationships that you can build with them. But our department works with all of the jurisdictions across the state to identify what the damages are with our federal partners from region, so that when it comes time for our governor to make a request, we've written that request with the data provided to us from our locals as well as from FEMA, and then it goes to the White House for the president to review.
Okay, now Traci, pick it up from there. We have met the threshold, or we think we have. What is Region 6 and FEMA's obligation from that point on?
So good morning, everyone. So the first thing that FEMA Region 6 will do, the events occurred, we're already coordinating with the state on what impacts there are, what things might look like. When we get a request for the joint preliminary damage assessment, one of the coordination factors that we do immediately is with the National Weather Service. We need an official weather service summary in order to determine what the weather impact was and ultimately establish what's called the incident period. And that incident period is the start and the finish dates of that incident. So ultimately, any damages caused by that storm within that incident period is what can be counted in the preliminary damage assessment. So when we get a request from the state, we will come out with the local jurisdiction, with the state, FEMA, and we will go out and validate the windshield survey and the state information on the preliminary damage assessment. And so when we go out, we are looking at any of the categories of work available in public assistance, being debris, emergency protective measures, roads and bridges, which is one of the big ones here in Oklahoma, water control facilities, public buildings and equipment, public utilities, and parks and recreation. As part of that, we're validating the damage, and we're also validating the estimated costs. If there are not estimated costs available, we have the ability to estimate those costs either using RS means or historical costs that you may have from previous road repairs or bridge repairs. And then as part of our check, we have to ensure that we're not duplicating any benefits or counting any costs that can be covered by another federal agency. So Federal Highway is a big one here. We validate all GPS coordinates and check to make sure they're not a major collector. If they are, we would reduce that cost estimate by that major collector. We also have to check for instance NRCS, USACE, any of those other federal agencies as well. We also reduce insurance. So we require insurance documentation on insurable facilities, and our estimated costs would be reduced by that insurance. There's also other things that cannot be included in an estimated cost. One of those being mitigation, one of those being additional upgrade or expansion of a damaged facility. We have to estimate a cost to restore to pre-disaster design and function. So once we've conducted all of those joint preliminary damage assessments, we've coordinated with the state, and we have what is the final total estimated cost for the preliminary damage assessments. If that estimated cost exceeds the state per capita indicator, which Alden indicated is almost $6 million for this fiscal year, that per capita indicator changes annually at the fiscal year. Additionally, counties would be included in that potential request if they meet their county per capita indicator, which we discussed this year is $3.78. It's something that we provide to the state every fiscal year, their state per capita plus their county per capita. So if that occurs and those per capitas are met, we then work with the state on their presidential request for a major or an emergency declaration. Part of that is a cover letter that they write, which basically tells your story, tells the impact of the disaster to your community, and also the types of damages that have occurred. It not only takes into account the estimated cost of assistance, which is the primary factor, but it also takes into account localized impacts, some of the insurance coverage in force, recent mitigation. So in events where the state may not have met the per capita indicator, they can in fact use recent mitigation that's been applied and what that cost savings amounted to because of that recent mitigation. So it's important to include that when you're talking to the state about any recent mitigation that you may have implemented that actually saved that road from washing out or saved that bridge. That is something that we take into account. Additionally, we take into account recent multiple disasters. How overwhelmed are your resources? How many recent disasters have you had? And then additionally, the other programs of federal assistance. And then we validate and we look at all of those factors based on the state's request from the governor, and then we make a regional recommendation up through our headquarters. And so once that regional recommendation is made up through our headquarters, it's evaluated at the FEMA headquarters level in Washington, D.C. It then goes with their recommendation to the Office of Management and Budget in Washington, D.C., and then finally it goes to the White House. And then essentially the timeline varies, but we will get notification back from our FEMA headquarters whether the White House has approved or denied a declaration request.
Well, I think the first question most elected officials would have, and you mentioned categories very early in your presentation, and there's like, I don't know, A down to
G.
P categories that the agency finally declares. A being emergency response, which historically has covered up to almost 100% on recovery or emergency response, as I remember.
All of our federal assistance has it's a 75-25, so it's a 25% cost share to the state for federal assistance under public assistance.
So none of the categories have 100% reimbursement?
No.
Okay. Well, they used to. In my day, they used to. But anyway, if you would lead us through how you get to A, B, C, D, and E. I mean, I know it goes down to P and gets down to parks and that sort of stuff. But what's the measure of the thresholds you get to decide those different categories?
So when we get a request from the state, one of the things we ask them to provide us if they can is what exactly we would be looking at on the preliminary damage assessment when we come out, so that we can ensure that, one, we have the right technical assistance and expertise available on the damage assessment. But typically when we get the request, we already know what we're going to be going out to look at, whether we're looking at Category C, roads and bridges, or whether we're looking at water control facilities, Category D. Any of those categories, whether it be emergency work or permanent work, goes towards the county's per capita threshold and the state's per capita threshold in a major disaster declaration request. The state can choose to request an emergency declaration, which they did first in this recent event for the May 7 through June 9 flooding, severe storms, tornadoes. So if it's an emergency declaration, typically what you'll see is only those emergency work categories included. Category A, debris, and Category B, emergency protective measures. Sometimes in an emergency declaration, actually what you'll see is only Category B limited to direct federal assistance. And we're seeing that more and more. For instance, if we had, for instance, Tropical Storm Barry that was coming in recently to the coast, they requested an emergency declaration and that's what they received. So they have ability then to request direct federal assistance from us. But then once that incident has occurred, we then have to do damage assessments to validate costs in order to add any of the other categories of damage. So essentially in an EM, you could get up to Category A and B, and then in a major, you can get all of those categories of work included, and they all count towards your per capita.
Okay, so the president has declared it now. FEMA will have individuals that will come into the state that will sit down with the elected officials and write the scope of work and approve the work under what's called a PW, is that correct?
That is correct. So once a declaration is awarded and given to the state by the president, typically in that Federal Register notice, there's designated a federal coordinating officer who will be the one who leads that declaration in the state. Typically, FEMA Region 6 will fill the leadership positions within public assistance or individual assistance declarations, but then we will work with the state and coordinate as to what level of federal assistance is needed. So last year or the year before, it was a smaller declaration here in Oklahoma, and so we actually co-located with the state in their offices, and our team that we sent was probably at the max 10 people. So we try to coordinate with the state to see what they want, and also what are the categories of damage, how many applicants do we think we're going to have, how many projects do we think we have, in order to estimate how many staff will come into the state to work on that disaster. We've recently implemented a PA delivery model. With this new declaration, most of you may be aware of that, but we now have what's called a grants portal. And so the process has changed a little bit in that you now have access to that grants portal once you get an approved request for public assistance. And then once you get into that grants portal, you have the ability to upload documentation. You identify your damage inventory line items. You work with our program delivery manager on your disaster dimensions and description. And then actually what happens when that work is done in the field, the actual costing, scoping, and writing of the project worksheet is now done at our Consolidated Resource Center. We have 4 of those across the country. The one that we have primarily is located in Denton, Texas. And so we no longer have the person in the field who's actually writing the PW and doing that cost and scoping. It's done at a consolidated center in Denton. Once that goes through, all the reviews are done, it comes back to the field for review, and then ultimately, if it's signed off on by the applicant and by the state, then we would obligate funds.
Okay, now, there are different levels of PWs, large PWs and small PWs, is that correct?
That is correct.
What are the dollar values between the two?
So the small project minimum dollar amount for this fiscal year is $3,200. So if you have a project that is below $3,200, it is not eligible for FEMA assistance. We'll typically work with the applicant in the state, and there's always the potential to combine projects so that you're above that small project minimum. The small project maximum is $128,900 this fiscal year, and so that is what just designates that as a small project. A large project would be anything over that $128,900.
For future accountability, is there an advantage for an elected official to break the projects into smaller projects or into large projects?
So I think there's multiple thoughts on that. Certainly a small project gets obligated quicker. It has less requirements for the state as far as monitoring and auditing, and it gets obligated and closed generally quicker than a large project. However, there can be advantages to a large project, or what we call also something you can opt into, which is our public assistance alternate pilot program, which we refer to as our 428 project, which you can combine either multiple facilities, multiple roads into a single 428 project. And with that project, we agree on a capped estimate, and then you have the ability, if there are excess funds, to use those excess funds for an additional eligible project. So there's some advantages to large and there's some advantages to small projects. I think from a local perspective, when it comes to small projects, sometimes we hear that they don't want to keep track of that many projects, and so sometimes they prefer a large. So there are different requirements between the two, but it's really a matter of what is best for that particular project and that particular applicant.
I'm sorry?
May I add?
Sure.
So when we start talking about large and small projects, there's not a broad brush that you can use to identify what community is going to be best fit by either one. So specifically for the audience in the room, Category C is the biggest category that I think the county commissioners deal with mostly. And that's going to be roads, the gravel roads. And we work very closely with each county commissioner or their staff that they identify in FEMA to say, what's the best fit for you? Because we can combine them into one large project, but you may have 100 or 200 individual sites on that project. It makes it a large project so that when you finally finish all of the work on those sites, we have to do a full and complete closeout review of that. So you have to have your tickets, you have to have your procurement, and I mean, it's just a very in-depth closeout review. With small projects, you don't have as deep of a dive on the closeout. So it gets the money to you as soon as we obligate the money from FEMA and the state. Whereas with a large project, it's reimbursement. So you don't get the money until the very end. So we want to make sure everyone understands there's not a one answer silver bullet here. We want to work with you individually so that you know the pros and the cons of asking for a large or a small project.
Okay. Well, one of the most frequently asked questions, most counties, when a disaster occurs, the first realization is they don't have the financial surplus to deal with it in the county. Is there a way for counties to borrow ahead and get advance funding in order to deal with the issues before the project's completed? Once the PWs are written, and let's say it's a $500,000 PW, is there a method within FEMA to draw an advance on a project in order to start on it and get it completed financially?
I'll
Yes.
let Alden take that because it's based on the state's administrative plan on how they handle that.
Great. In our state, yes, there is a method for that. So once the project's obligated, that's when FEMA releases the money into what's called SmartLink, and it comes to the state for us to manage. If an applicant needs seed money or whatever you want to call it to get their project moving, we can do what's called an advance of funds. One of the things that we ask for after working with our state auditor's office is a work plan, as well as an exact amount of money that they think they're going to need in order to get the project moving. And then we're going to follow up with that community as the project goes, and to help validate what they've already spent so that if they need additional funding, we can make maybe a secondary advance. Typically, we only advance 50% of the total project amount, so that's what the project itself is going to cost. FEMA reimburses 75% of that, and then in our state, we'll cover 12.5% if the state has the money. And then we'll work with the jurisdiction to do up to 70, the full federal share of the advance if necessary.
Okay, another frequently asked question. Once this disaster is declared and the grant's provided, the state receives the grant, the counties are the sub-grantee, but the counties are perceived as a whole and not by commissioner district. And when you close out, it is an obligation relieved or assigned to the county based on the final declaration as to whether they met the scope of work. Is that correct?
That's correct. We look at the applicant, which is the county. Each project is closed on its own. So if you have 5 large projects, each project's going to get its own closeout. For small projects, in our state, we do a random validation. So we wait for all of the projects, all the small projects to be completed in the county, not the district, in the county. And then we'll randomly select about 20% of them, and we'll come validate them. Usually it's taking a picture and saying, yeah, there's a stop sign there that got ripped out by the tornado. And then at that point, that's when we'll release either the remaining state funding or whatever remaining federal funding there is, which with small projects, it's our standard practice to pay the full federal share once it's obligated.
Once FEMA has made their declaration, and it's obviously a project that needs improvement in order to make sure it does not reoccur, or I guess you call it mediation for future, okay? Are there additional dollars available for counties that want to upgrade say a bridge or something that would move it out of the danger zone for a future occurrence?
So there are a number of options. One of those being within public assistance 406 mitigation. So that is 406 mitigation that would allow you to do additional mitigation to that project on top of what the cost estimate is for that project. Additionally, you can request through public assistance an improved project, or if you don't want to restore what is damaged to pre-disaster design, but you want to do something else, you can request an alternate project. Alternate projects used to have a 10% reduction. Under the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, there is no longer that 10% reduction to alternate projects, so that certainly makes it more appealing to a jurisdiction who may want to do an alternate project. And then additionally, every time a state gets a major disaster declaration, they also get hazard mitigation funding. So you can also apply to the state with projects to basically compete for that hazard mitigation funding that's available statewide. So every state has their priorities and how they want to make available that 404 hazard mitigation funding. But when you get a disaster declaration, that mitigation funding is available statewide regardless of what counties got declared. So there's a number of ways in which to make those improvements or further mitigate a project.
When Traci talks about 404 and 406, she's talking about the Stafford Act that establishes all of the FEMA programs, and those are the sections of the Stafford Act that reference that. And it's important to note that in order for a community to be eligible for 404 hazard mitigation funding, they have to have an approved hazard mitigation plan, a local approved hazard mitigation plan.
That was going to be my next question, as a matter of fact.
So it is available statewide, but you have to have a current plan.
Okay, every county is supposed to have a hazard mitigation plan of anticipation of what the problems are or concerns in the county. First of all, do you know how many counties have actually been declared in the state of Oklahoma during this recent flooding event?
Yes, so we've had two disasters, two incident periods starting April 30th and ending on June 9th. The first incident period is April 30th and May 1st. We received 18 counties for public assistance, and we may request a few additional counties be added to that disaster. And then for the second disaster that started on May 7th through June 9th is that incident period. We've so far have had 41 counties added on for public assistance. We've had 27 counties added for individual assistance. And we recently put in a request to add an additional 5 counties for public assistance. And we may be asking for a few more to be added before we get to the deadline to add on.
Well, I'm lost in the math.
Yeah.
Is that about 59 counties?
By the end of it all, we anticipate there being around 60 counties, both disasters being declared. So the vast majority of our state.
Well, my math was pretty close.
It was pretty close.
Okay. For the flooding events and the counties who had a hazard mitigation plan, some of the counties are experiencing, under the National Flood Insurance Program, kind of lead us through compliance with rebuilding, certification of loss, or whatever is engaged in that, because the first thing everybody's thinking about doing is rebuilding their life and time is the most important issue they've got for them. So if you will, if that's within your purview to talk about how that process works between you, the state, and the counties.
So once a disaster occurs, the county floodplain administrator and the county is the one who actually makes the decision on whether or not something is substantially damaged. If it gets a substantial damage determination, then the county can decide whether to require elevation or whether to work with the state on a potential buyout project. So there are some misconceptions about that FEMA is actually the one telling you that you're substantially damaged or you're required to elevate, when in fact that is actually a county decision. The one thing FEMA does have is obviously our National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP, and you can certainly go to that website and find out if you're interested whether your home is in a floodplain, whether it's in a special flood hazard area or whether it's in a floodplain, and then your county would make the requirements for that. If you're not a participating county in NFIP, then you do not have that ability to get that flood insurance. So a participating county in NFIP is one thing for that, and then the NFIP mapping is the other. But another misconception is that if you don't live in a floodplain, you can't get flood insurance, and that is not true. Anybody is eligible to get flood insurance, whether you live in a floodplain or not. And in fact, if you don't live in a floodplain, it's cheaper for you. And many of our floods here in the recent years have been over the 500-year flood, the 100-year flood. Properties have flooded that typically don't flood. So that's something that we encourage everyone to look into. But when it comes to substantial damage determinations and whether or not a county is making people elevate or looking at buyouts, that is actually a county decision, and that would be something your floodplain administrator working with your county officials would make that decision. So the sooner they make that decision, obviously the better, because once the FEMA funding goes into the hands of the survivor, as you said, they want to get back to recovery. They want to repair their homes or they want to rebuild. And so the last thing anybody wants is to put that money into their home only to be told later that now they have to elevate or now that they're being bought out. So that is something that we can certainly work with you all, and we do have under the new Disaster Recovery Reform Act, we actually do provide reimbursement for a county who's doing the substantial damage inspections and determinations. So that is something that we can assist with, but that is done at the county level.
Okay, well, I think one important thing you said was you need to be working in order to preserve your national flood insurance program in every county, because without compliance, you could be in danger of losing it. And if you lose it, then several bad things can happen in your county. Lenders lose their ability to lend. People lose their ability to develop, that sort of thing. Okay, so we're now going to move from FEMA's presence in the state and OEM engaged in it. And the major headache that now falls to the state of Oklahoma and Auditor Byrd's office is compliance with the federal accountability. So Cindy, we're going to turn to you. What's your office's first role after these declarations have been made, PWs have been written, some work has been done, money's drawn down? Where are you going to go from there?
Well, at this point, we've had the disaster, and FEMA and OEM has come in like Santa Claus and sprinkled some money out to help us get back on track, and everyone's happy, but you've got to know how you're going to spend this money. And you've got to get your services provided, you've got to get things back on track because your constituents are depending on you and what you can do for them. So our first thing to do is to try to reach out with you to make sure you're documenting all of these expenditures and what you do, because we've got to Then the state auditor's office gets to come in and be the bad guy and say, well, all this was good and you've done a great job, but you didn't report it correctly. So we want to head that off. Someone in my office a couple of weeks ago said, now, for the last 8 years, you've done FEMA training once every 4 years. Is this a pattern? Are we going to do this once every 4 years? And I said, well, maybe you need to speak to Mother Nature about that, because that seems to be about the time that we're having these big disasters, and we have to come back together to make sure we know how to properly report things. So thank you, Jean, for inviting me to come and talk to you all and getting us all on the right, starting on the right foot on this, because I want to give you every tool you need in your toolbox to have a good audit. And it's very easy to do. This stuff isn't secret. We don't have some big magic potion out here where we're hiding to say, aha, we're here, we're going to audit you now. I want to give you everything up front. I want to let you know what we need to see exactly when we come to see you to do your audit. And that really had to start, as you all were talking, from the minute that the disaster occurred. Because what happens the minute the disaster occurs? You've got to start getting your hands out here. You've got to start using your stock inventory to repair things with your rock, with your tin horns. You've got to get people mobile again. From the very minute a disaster starts, the money clock starts running. So that's where we're at.
Well, let's start with what are the biggest don'ts?
The biggest don'ts. Don't ignore the reporting requirements. Here's the thing, county government has such a great infrastructure for collecting money and spending money. I know you guys feel like you have rules out your nose on how you're supposed to spend this money. And you all do a great job of complying with those laws, right? But when it comes to the FEMA expenditures and we come in to audit, you say, well, everything was spent on a purchase order. Yes, everything was spent on a purchase order, just like all of your roads and highway funds, your general fund, everything. We don't know which POs. So you've got to leave us the breadcrumbs to know how you documented that.
Well, a new term cropped up in your life called CFA several years ago.
It's a 4-letter word.
Schedule Federal, and you finish it up. But
Schedule of expenditures of federal awards.
okay. Every county obviously went into shock at that point because that was something new that they really had not ever done.
That's true.
So if you will, share with the group what that was, why we had to do it, and what's the tool for you in completing your process.
Okay, can we take a little stroll down memory lane for just a few
we
seconds?
can go way down memory lane.
Okay, so back in 2008 to 2011, and you all would probably know this much better than I do, how many disasters did we have? Every year it seemed like we had ice storms. I mean, it was crazy. And those were the big disasters that we dealt with at that time. So we had these ice storms, and there was another thing that happened during that time. In 2008, the federal government, the General Accounting Office put out a new rule that your auditor could no longer prepare your financial statements. Well, what had the state auditor's office been doing for you all for years? We had been coming, those were the good old days. You liked for us to do it. We liked doing those financial statements. But they come in and they said, you can no longer complete the financial statement and then also audit it because you're auditing your own work. So whenever that happened, we could no longer go out here and prepare your financial statement and this thing called the CFA. So the CFA's been around a long time. It's just that we never talked to you about it because we were happy to do it for you ourselves. Because what happens when you do it yourself? You think you're always right. So it was a win-win for us. We did it. It was right. Moving on. So we had to come out here and start talking to you about this in 2011. Right after my predecessor was elected, he put me in charge of county government, and I needed to come out and break the bad news. It was a very rough time. I know a lot of you probably packed rotten tomatoes whenever you came to these conferences to throw at me. But you all rose to the challenge. You did a great job. And this CFA, remember, this is not just about FEMA. This is about every single federal grant that comes through your county. So you got to remember that. This CFA is how you report to the federal government how much money your county spent each year in federal expenditures. It's very important. They want to know if they're going to give you money that you're keeping good track of it. So we've all gotten on board with this, and we still have a few bumps here and there, but it seems like the one thing that we keep coming back to, that we keep having problems with, is the documentation of FEMA expenditures. Now, why do you think that is? And you all mentioned something very interesting earlier, and I know this, and I hope this sunk in with every one of you. FEMA and OEM do not give money to a district. They give it to a county. Now, it may be in your district, and you may be responsible for requisitioning and spending those funds, but it is awarded to the county. So what happens if you have one person in your county not pulling their weight? In this instance, the whole county is going to look bad. Now, you can get in front of the news and you can scream and holler all you want, but the problem is the written report that goes out, and we try to put on there, you know, I'm not picking on any district. District 2 did not keep this and this, but all the public hears is the county didn't take care of their FEMA funds. So that's why this is so important to you. You've got to want to make a difference with this, and you've got to want to document these expenditures. Second problem we're seeing with this is, I can sit here, and I love seeing county commissioners. I love coming to these conferences. This is great. But the problem is, you're not the one filling out the paperwork, right? Are there any commissioners in here who fill out the paperwork?
Ask for a show of hands.
I was going to say, this is an honest group. So what we've got to do is we've got to get this information to the person in your district who's responsible for doing the paperwork, because we want to help you get this paperwork right. We want to help you bring it together. And you know, Tulsa, Wagner, and Muskogee counties, I believe you all are the 3 hardest hit counties in this state. You're going to have a ton of paperwork. I see one of the commissioners over here smiling, and he's probably thinking, yeah, this is going to be bad. It's not going to be bad, because the state auditor's office is going to be there to hold your hand and help you get it right. And we've already reached out to have some training over there, and it's going to be great. It's going to be hard work, and this time next year we're all going to be smiling about this. But that is where we're at. That's where we're at with this, and we've got to get that together.
Well, I think that what we don't know is what we don't understand a lot of times. And when the CFA program came out, reluctance to change is pretty strong, and everybody was concerned about what we were doing. And I think Cindy just said something that's extremely important, and has said it every time. The auditor's office, FEMA, OEM, their principal role is to assist the applicant in the counties. Not that they're not adversaries, they're advocates. And if you have a problem in any part of the documentation, or your support personnel in the courthouse is having difficulty, I hope the message is this morning, they can contact anybody up here or anybody here, and it's a purpose to help us get through this issue, not to catch us in a bad deal. Okay, there's always been the question as to who has primary monitoring, primary auditing, double auditing. OEM was doing auditing for a while. Is that correct? Or are they still doing it now?
We've never been auditors. We do closeout validations, but we're not auditors. That's the state auditor.
Well, describe the distinction between closeout and auditing.
A closeout, we're validating what you're telling us. So if you say that you spent $100,000 on gravel, we ask you to provide us the procurement document that you used to buy the gravel, and then the invoice and the check that you used to pay for the gravel. If you can provide us that documentation, that meets the closeout requirement. Now, our state auditor, I'm sure she can speak to what they look to when they come to look at that $100,000 expenditure, but there's a distinct difference.
All right, on your closeouts, do you share that information directly with the auditor's office?
We can. Most of the time, the information that goes to the state auditor's office will come from the local. They'll ask for their information that we have, if there are any gaps that we can help them fill, and then they'll work with whoever's auditing them to get it. But if the state auditor, they're our state partners, so we'll work with them however we can to support whatever they're working on.
Do you share that back with FEMA?
Yes, we do.
So, to make it somewhat simple, when the PW is completed, request is sent in for reimbursement. your primary responsibility is to come in and do a closeout and a monitor of that specific PW, is that correct?
For a large project, yes, and for a small project, it's to only validate that the work was completed.
And that's an important distinction, because when we talked about whether it be an advantage for a county to have a large project or a small project, a smaller project under $128,900, there isn't the same requirement under the closeout as it is to a large project, is that correct?
There are the same requirements, it's just the state isn't required to do as in-depth of a closeout for a small project. So they're still required to maintain the same documentation they would for a large project. We just don't do a closeout on it.
And any project for federal funding, whether it be small or large, can be subject to an audit. So the requirements for the project don't change, just the monitoring and the closeout is what changes. Would they have to validate the work was completed on a small project? They don't have to do the documentation of the invoice, the pay, all of those things, but you still are required under federal law to maintain those documents in case you're ever subject to an audit.
Can I also add something here about the monitoring versus the auditing?
Absolutely. I was getting ready to ask you that.
Okay, sorry to jump ahead. Okay, so the monitoring is not going to look at all of the requirements like we do in an audit. The federal government is very specific on who does what part of the reviewing, let's just call it reviewing, overall umbrella here, reviewing. So after they come in and they monitor, and I might also point out that Alden did say that on small projects, they're only looking at 20%. They're not even looking at 100% of that. So keep that in mind. They're monitoring to see if it appears you spent it in accordance with that PW. Because remember, the PW is where it starts. We've got to look at that to figure out what you were supposed to spend the money on. But then there's a whole other part of rules that we follow in accordance with the CFA. And remember, CFA is not just FEMA, CFA is all of your federal funds. So we have this big, huge book called a compliance supplement. The federal government puts it out every single year, and it tells us exactly how to audit FEMA, along with all of your other grants that you have. So if we go through a matrix and we look at your FEMA, and that's what we're supposed to audit, this is just a small part of that book, and it's available to all of you. I'll get this to any of you that want it. This is what the state auditor's office is supposed to do. And again, it's no secret formula here. This is out there for every one of you to look at to see what we're going to be auditing when we come to see you. So as you're looking at this, our auditing is a lot more in depth. The federal government also says that we're required to look at the internal controls you have in place. Now, what are we talking about? So somebody roll their eyes with internal controls, because they want to know you know what you're doing. Nobody likes to put money in one person's hands and say, you go take care of it. They want to know somebody else is checking and making sure it was spent the way it was supposed to be spent. So in our audit, we're going to look at every little bit of documentation that you have. We're going to make sure that the matching requirement was met. And of course, that's something that's dependent on how much money the state has and what you have together. So we're looking at a little more than what Alden might be looking at from OEM's part. One of the things in the past, and I believe the commissioners who told me this, because this happened back around 2011, they would tell me that the person who was out there writing their PW took their documentation. I heard this from so many different county commissioners, and then we were actually able to get some documentation for one county back. I know it happened. Listen to me on this. You don't ever give your documentation away. People can make copies of it, they can scan it, they can do whatever, but that documentation is your responsibility, and if you don't have that, I can't give you credit for all of the hard work you did to document these expenditures. So please, please keep that in mind.
Yes.
Once your audit activity is completed and your final report is given for closeout, if there are some disputes in the final numbers, what is the process for for additional review or for objection to the audit. Without a doubt, I mean, when you have multi-million-dollar audits, you know, maybe a truck driver doesn't turn a ticket in or
Right.
something of that nature. But are there provisions, protections built into the counties where the county's going to appeal what the final audit closeout reflects from your perspective?
Well, and I want to remind you all of this, and I've said this in many conferences not related to FEMA. If you ever feel like we have written a finding incorrectly, you pick up the phone and you call the supervisor. If you can't resolve it with the supervisor, you pick up the phone and you call the manager. If you can't resolve it with the manager, you pick up the phone and you call me. I want to give you every opportunity to get it right. Now, we may be finished with the audit and leave and have not finished the report yet. And if you find that documentation then, you call me and you tell me and we'll come back and look at it. I am begging to give you every single bit of credit that I can give you. We will listen to that. But if you don't have the documentation, I can't give you the credit. So in answer to Jean's question, we don't like to let it get to a final report finding before we have this conversation. We have these conversations while we're there in the county with you. Up until the time that we get ready to finish that report. As you all know, our process for issuing reports, while we're there, we tell you everything that we found. We give you the findings. We come back at a later time to do the final exit conference with you. We lay the finding in front of you as it is going to be written in a report. We ask you to respond to it. At that point, I would say that's the final safeguard. If you disagree, speak up. But even before it's published on our website, you can still call me if you find something. So please know you have a voice. You have a voice with the state auditor.
Good, very good. That's encouraging. Traci, I'm going to move back to you just for a second. Every time a disaster is declared, it seems like there's a rush of new people running to our states and in the form of being contractors that says, hey, we'll take care of every bit of this for you. And we'll do this for whatever the administrative fee is or whatever. And in some cases, it works very, very well. But for many counties, it is an opportunity for the counties to do their own work. I know that FEMA has never taken a specific stance on contract vendors versus counties actually doing it. But to get into the weeds just a little bit, allowable cost for a county, if they decide to do it internally, they can recover their equipment cost per hour. They can recover overtime outside the normal working hours. You might just lead the group through what a county can actually do within their declaration with their own workforce.
Yes, so we would look at your current pay policy, and if your pay policy allows for overtime, then FEMA would reimburse for overtime. We only reimburse for straight time account labor as it relates to the debris pilot. But otherwise, overtime is allowable. If it's in your current pay policy, it has to be a pay policy that was in effect prior to the disaster. It can't be implemented after a disaster declaration. So we could pay your overtime for force account labor. We also can pay hours for force account equipment. So if a county or a district does have the ability to do that work and recover on their own, there is that reimbursement eligibility under force account labor and equipment. Additionally, through public assistance under the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, subrecipients are now eligible up to 5% of your total obligated cost of your project worksheets. So that has to be something that is, once again, reasonable up to 5%. It requires a documentation in order to justify that, but that is something that was not available to a subrecipient before. So they now get management costs up to 5% of their actual obligations. And so that is, if most of you are aware, that's a Cat Z PW for your projects. So that's an additional management cost money that you can use to either, one, administer your grants, or it's something that you can potentially use if you are choosing to hire a contractor to help you with your recovery. But one of the things that I'll point out as you were talking about some of the common mistakes that we find, we do want to make sure that you are doing all your contracting and procurement in accordance with the federal law, because when it's not a disaster declaration, you have your state laws, but if it's a federal disaster declaration, you do have to abide by 2 CFR 200, and contracting and procurement is one of the things that we find most mistakes on. But there are ways to get reimbursement if you want to do the work on your own, or there are ways to get management costs as well.
Well, one of the frequently asked questions, if a disaster occurs and it takes special equipment for a county to perform, are there additional grants for a county to go out and buy specialized equipment that's needed within that disaster?
So on a case-by-case basis, some of that certainly can be eligible under public assistance for reimbursement. So that would be something that you would want to talk to your program delivery manager in advance prior to procuring something, especially if you're expecting federal reimbursement. So definitely something you should coordinate with your program delivery manager in the state to ensure that it would be an eligible cost before you go out and procure it.
Well, you know, it's been well documented that, and I'll use out-of-state communities, not in our state, but I think Pine Bluff, Arkansas, several years ago, had something like a $3 or $4 million disallowance based on what actually occurred within the disaster. The vendor contractor came in and told them he was going to take care of everything, and everything was an allowable cost, and they found out that it wasn't. Is there a rule of thumb, or is there some measure that counties can use when they look at these contractors to protect the county itself from one of these huge payback provisions within the FEMA declaration?
So if you hear about a FEMA approved list of contractors, there is no such thing. So I would be wary of anyone who's telling you that they're pre-approved by FEMA. Also, I would check the debarment list to ensure that a contractor is not on the debarment list. And otherwise, I would, like we do for a lot of things, you check references, you check the reputation of the contractor. But we certainly don't advocate for any contractor, but we would want you to make sure you contract properly, that you check the debarment list, and those sorts of things if you're selecting a contractor. And then always, you're going to get assigned a program delivery manager from FEMA. Typically, you're going to have a weekly meeting with that person. So ask those questions. Don't just rely on that advice from one person. Ask those questions about eligibility so that you get the best advice and you know in advance what would be eligible. Because the last thing we want to do is de-obligate a bunch of money because it turns out what you did was not eligible. And if I could for just a second, talk about some of the things that we see occur over and over, and that being non-compliance with environmental and historic preservation. You have to make sure that what was approved in the scope of work of your project worksheet is what you did. If you're planning to do something outside of that, whether it's outside the footprint, whether it's outside that scope of work, you have to come back to FEMA in the state for approval. We find over and over again that they may have been intending to do the right thing, but you did work outside of the scope of work and not compliant with environmental and historic preservation. And we have federal laws that we have to abide by under those environmental and historic preservation rules. And so that can jeopardize your funding right away. It could essentially require us to de-obligate all funding for that project if you're not in compliance. So please make sure that you understand the scope of work and you only do work that's approved inside that scope of work. There's a lot of confusion sometimes when it comes to roads about the right-of-way. You think you're doing work within your right-of-way, so it's eligible. Your scope of work in your project worksheet will typically approve so many feet within your right-of-way. So we've found a lot of times that there can be cultural resources impacted, there could be tribal burial grounds impacted, and that is something that will jeopardize your federal funding right away.
Well, you brought up the environmental requirements under federal law, and that would primarily probably be with debris removal and debris. It has to be approved by an environmental officer as to the content of the debris, how it's dealt with, and where it's put. Is that correct?
Yes, so your debris does have to have permitted sites. So before you go and take debris somewhere, you want to make sure that your state has permitted that site before you go and dump that debris. There's also, of course, other requirements under debris for monitoring and all of those things. But yes, there are EHP requirements in debris removal as well.
Okay. Now, Alden, does that come under your purview for state approval on sites?
It'd be the Department of Environmental Quality.
All right, so what's the advice for the counties? If they got debris removal, they go through DEQ and get a sign off on a site?
Correct. Yes. DEQ, like our department, they have regional assets and across the state that communities can reach out to and ask those types of questions.
Okay. All three of you, from a state or federal perspective, the question's always asked. The private landowner would like for us to get on their land to remove debris, material, whatever it may be. Is that covered under your provision at all and fed from the federal level, or is that purely a state, local issue with the district attorney?
So with a major disaster declaration, private property debris removal is not something that's automatically allowable. It requires a request from the state to FEMA, and it does require pre-approval for any private property debris removal. So you can't do private property debris removal until that is approved by FEMA.
If I may add, though, I want to make sure everyone understands that once the debris has been pushed off of private property onto public property, it can be eligible under the PA program. So even though it started out on the private property, it's now in the public right-of-way.
Okay. So long as right away in is reimbursable for the time and effort, whatever they're doing. On the private property, that's a local district attorney issue and whether it could be allowable or not allowable under the scope of work, correct?
It'd be a case-by-case basis, yes.
Okay. Well, that's pretty excellent. You know, we had, especially in the floods, we had a lot of white goods and air conditioning that took special requests to evaporate the freon and that sort of thing. So that was a big issue for a lot of our communities at this point. Cindy, when you do your audit and the counties are doing the work themselves and they're charging back equipment time, how do you reconcile what's allowable and what's not allowable as far as your audit is concerned?
Well, I'm glad you asked that because I had just written that down to make sure we covered this. I'd like to touch on all three areas, whether it be time charged, your materials charged, or whether it is your equipment depreciation. So your timesheets, your employees fill out timesheets, but unless you use the prescribed timesheets to document time charged to FEMA, as an auditor, I have no way to know if you just give me a standard timesheet if that was charged to FEMA or not. So you've got to use the right forms. Don't just give me your 12 timesheets you have for the year and think I can pick out how much time should have been charged to FEMA. You've got to clearly document it and document the sites that you've been working on. We have forms for that. When it comes to your stock that you keep at the barn, or whether you are ordering something to be delivered directly to the site, you've got to leave us a paper trail there. Now to Jean's question about your equipment usage. You know, the best way I could equate this is If you use your personal vehicle to drive up here today to a conference and you get a mileage reimbursement because it's out of county travel, where does that money go? You already had your vehicle. It's kind of extra money, you can think of it that way, although it's still wear and tear in your vehicle. So think about this with your county equipment. You've got this equipment sitting out here and you're using it. You're getting to charge by the hour based on the FEMA equipment list rate reimbursement. That's what we go to audit. I mean, there's a stipulation, as long as it is that rate or lower, it's an allowable expense to the project worksheet. So you've got to make sure you're using the correct rates. You've also got to document what you used that equipment, what project you used it on. So if you're using your trackhoe today for some kind of large debris removal, I've got to know what site that was and how many hours to trace it back to what you charged to this project worksheet. That's very important though, because that equipment usage rate can add up and can be a substantial amount of money. Now then, once you've documented that, and the next question usually is, how do I report that expenditure because they're giving me money for using my equipment? Whatever you charged is automatically the expense. So at the end of the year, as you're adding up you just think of it as yourself. What was your expense for mileage in my personal? Well, it's whatever they gave me because I've already spent it. That's why they reimbursed me. So think about it in that manner.
Well, one of the thorny issues that we have seen in the past is when they get reimbursement for overtime or extra employees they bring in for a disaster. The fringe benefit package varies from county to county, or it could. What's actually used to calculate the fringe benefit add-on to the actual salary? Because we've had some cases where counties were not actually reimbursed based on those rates differed from county to county. So what do you look at from the auditor's office?
Okay, the best thing you can do is go become best friends with the payroll clerk in the county. And you've got to pick out which things would be attributable to overtime. Now we're talking about emergency work because you get to charge straight time and overtime to that. And then on permanent work, you're not charging you're charging your straight time but not overtime. So there's a difference there. So you've got to know which project you're working on first. But for instance, if you're charging overtime, that retirement rate on OPERS, which is going to be in that little printout the payroll clerk gives you, that's not something you can use to calculate your hourly rate for overtime, because overtime is not used for retirement, right? Yes. Then you have to look at your other benefits that you're providing. Those could be calculated to be reimbursed for. So you've got to look at all of this together, and your payroll clerk is going to be your best resource to go look and see what that average hourly rate is. And it's very easy to calculate, and we probably should get something out in writing on what is allowable and what is not. So we'll work on that.
When a disaster is declared and under the Purchasing Act for the state of Oklahoma, can your district attorney waive the Competitive Bidding Act during that declaration time?
Well, okay, so you said something earlier about the procurement policies that you're supposed to use. I'm looking at CFR 2-200.318A. Is that the same one you're looking at? Okay, I'm going to read this because I quickly had someone send this to me. It states that the non-federal entity, that's you, must use its own documented procurement procedures which reflect applicable state, local, and tribal laws and regulations, provided that the procurements conform to applicable federal law and the standards identified in this part. So whenever I read that, I had a lot of questions about what that exactly says, because I'm not sure the last time this was updated, but this is not the exact wording that I remember from about 5 years ago. And you know, as we all know, the one thing certain in life is change. So we need to look at that, but my previous understanding was that a district attorney could not waive the bidding requirements related to a federal program. Is that your understanding?
You're correct. So we had, for instance, an example in Hurricane Harvey. The governor waived the state procurement requirements for a period of time. Under FEMA rules or under 2 CFR 200, even though the governor may have done that, you still are required to follow the federal rules. And so you can essentially try to prove on a case-by-case basis exigent circumstances where for this period of time we were in response and we used this procurement or contract under the waiver. By my understanding is the governor can do that. But you have to, in the meantime, be moving toward procurement or contracting under the federal laws, the state laws, and all of that. So that is not necessarily a pre-approval to do so, but you can argue under exigent circumstances that you needed to do that, but then you came in line with all of the requirements within a certain period of time. So even though it may be waived on the state level, essentially they cannot waive the requirements under the federal law.
Okay.
I have a quick question for you, and I don't mean to put you on the spot with this, but this thought just came to mind. One of the things that we've struggled with over the last few years is the Public Competitive Bidding Act for public construction and those bidding requirements versus our requirements in Title 19, 1505, which are for materials, goods, and services, and it also now talks about some contracts there. Do you consider debris removal to be any type of construction?
I don't believe so. That doesn't fit under the construction rules. And Tony Furr is here. He's our debris SME with FEMA. So I'm going to let Tony answer that question if you don't mind.
Debris is not typically considered construction. That's what I can you elaborate more on that?
Well, debris removal would be, I'm just using in the simple form, debris removal. Because right now, to my knowledge, there is no requirement at the state or local level to bid debris removal in any form.
Oh, you're talking about a contract for debris removal services.
Yes.
Okay.
So how does that fit in at the federal level, and how would that apply to these commissioners?
Okay, at the federal level.
Let me give you my microphone here. There you go.
The federal level has no distinction between construction and debris removal in that sense of the word. Because when you're looking at federal procurement practices, remember the federal government is not a party to that contract. So debris removal has to comply with the same procurement regulations as any other building, bridge, road, anything like that. Now, one thing that has started to pop up lately is people have started to question landfill cost, tipping fees. Well, why didn't you competitively bid your landfill cost? Landfill's not something you can competitively bid because there's not one on every corner.
Right.
So, you might get 30 cents cheaper, but it's 60 miles away. So your haul cost is going to drastically outweigh any savings. But I hope, did that answer your question?
Yeah, for debris removal contractors, we look at it as the same as if you were contracting for any other service. So for a debris removal contractor, you still have to follow all those same rules for competitive bidding. You can pre-procure contracting as long as you followed all of those rules. And in fact, we encourage that you do that, but you also have to ensure that you're updating that every certain frequency to ensure that you're still in line with the procurement and contracting requirements. But for those services, we don't distinguish between debris removal and construction. It all has the same requirements.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we're getting close to wrapping up here. This has been extremely informative, I think, for everybody in the room, and we really appreciate you being here. And I'm not trapping Cindy because I've already told her I'm going to ask her a couple of questions that have absolutely nothing to do with the subject matter this morning. But it's the questions being asked by virtually every elected official in the state of Oklahoma, as we said here. We were sent out a bulletin from your office that addressed the approaches as to dealing with pay raises, that if a county has room for a pay raise, and has the ability to give a pay raise within their budget. What is your recommendation before the new formula starts November 1st?
Okay. And he didn't put me on the spot. He warned me this would be a question. And right after he called me, Commissioner Gary Starnes called me with this same question. And so I'm going to very carefully state this, and I'm also going to state this at the general session too, because I want you all to know this. We think there might be a possibility you can do this. Before I give you the go ahead and say yes, I want the AG's office involved, and I'm going to coordinate with Trent Baggett at the District Attorney's Council to get all 27 DAs on board with this as well. I just feel like this is a very sensitive topic and that we need to be very careful, dot all of our I's, cross all of our T's, and make sure we're giving you good advice. So I'm working on that right this minute. I think that's going to be a possibility. I know that this is a very important time with you in crafting your budgets and trying to plan. So we do understand that time is of an urgency here. The bulletin that we sent out, and it had the highlighted part here, it is our job to always give you the conservative answer, to take care of you. And you know that the State Auditor's Office does take that responsibility seriously. We want to help you get the right information. We know your district attorneys are busy and sometimes can't answer those questions. So we're going to do this. This bulletin was meant to give you the good advice. Now then that Gary and Jean have asked me this question, we decided there was a need to try to research this for you. Now then, no one knows how horrible this whole salary issue was than I do. I lived it through an election and was blamed for it. But I am going to say this. If you are in a county and you have not, if you are a county official and you have not personally sat down and recalculated that salary formula to figure out if you are in compliance or not, you better do it, because there was just another county that went through this. I can't give you any credit or help you out if you're not doing it on your side. So I'm just telling you. There may be other counties out there out of compliance. If you find it and correct it before I get there, I can at least give you the credit that you found it first. That's what an internal control is, and that's why it's important. So, sorry for the soapbox moment, but we've got to get on board with that. So we're working on this for you. We will be getting you an answer soon, and I will have Cheryl send it out as an addendum to this bulletin. So however you received this bulletin, you will also receive the addendum in the same manner.
In order to provide a little clarity, if you're at midterm or you're elected, the question is that we're trying to seek the answer for. If you have, after November 1, it's not going to have any, this question will go away under the new provisions of the law. But if you have room within your budget and you have room within your formula for a salary increase for elected officials in the courthouse, this is what we're trying to reconcile as to whether that's permissible or not. You know, going back down memory lane, I mean, there's been several issues, one being a court challenge out of Tulsa County that all county officials had to be paid at the same rate. And so we had been kind of operating it when the first big raise occurred under state law change. We had half of our county courthouses for 2 years that made substantially less money than the other officials in the courthouses. So they tried to reconcile that, and we were moving along pretty well. Now, the second part of my question is, under the new formula that is going to be enacted on November the 1st, can you share with an explanation as to how the new formula may differ from the old formula?
Yes. First of all, another Cindy Byrd soapbox is that there shouldn't be a formula for county government. There is no formula for your superintendents or your city managers in your local government. And it is time that you all, I'm going to borrow Jean's wording here, get to know your representative and your senator and start making this case. It is time to put the scandal of the 70s and the 80s to bed and let them know how transparent you are. So that is something that I have been telling every representative and senator who has come to me with this issue. Why do we even have it? Now then, back to the question at hand. So how does this affect you going forward? Well, what do we know about our Constitution? You don't get to change the Constitution without a vote of the people. The Constitution has a provision that an elected official will not have a salary increase in the middle of a term. So now we have this law, and this law has been changed. And so once the law changes, we're on a line here that everyone has to be at their next term before they can enact this new law. Okay? So that means if you don't have a raise before November 1st of this year, after that point, the salaries will be either staggered or no one gets a raise until 2023. That's what that means, because of a constitutional provision that we can't just go get a law change to fix it. So at some point, and you know, Representative Bowles he's done a lot, and he really wants to help county government. So I understand what he's saying, because no matter what, you all weren't going to like it, because one, just like me, you don't like change. I don't like change of any kind most of the time. But two, you have to have a change to go forward. So until the law was changed, you couldn't get any increases going forward. So I don't know the best answer for this. I kind of stayed out of this because, as you all know, the election was pretty hard on me regarding the salary issue. And I let them know, again, my question was, whenever they came to me, why do we even have one? Why are we trying to fix something that shouldn't exist in the first place? You know what's going to happen if the salaries get too high? You're going to have an opponent at every single election. There's already a built-in control there. It's not going to happen. So keep these things in mind. If you're going to change the law, you've got to still follow what the Constitution says, and you can't get a raise in the middle of a term. Whenever the law has changed, you have to wait until your next term for that increase to take effect.
To reinforce her first suggestion on going out and calculating the formula in the county. One of the reasons that the new formula was instituted by the legislature was to try to bring several counties in compliance that were out of compliance, and there was a large number of them. And unfortunately, the big media case that's been out there right now, I read in the paper the other day, they've turned to the grand jury in Oklahoma City, because nobody seems to have an answer on how to recover the dollars that elected officials were overpaid. So it is absolutely essential that you get within your courthouse, get with your treasurer, get with the people involved, and your county clerks, make sure you're in compliance with it. And if you've got room, if we get a good ruling, you do have an opportunity to move the salaries up to the max if you've got the capability in your county to do it. Now, I know this is a subject near and dear to Cindy's heart, and it's essential to everybody's heart in this room. You're close to the pulse of the state capitol. We know they're going to have an interim study on home rule. I know how you feel about it. Assess and share with the group what you see in the risk and what your recommendations are, which we know.
Okay, so I spent more time this last session, my first time at the Capitol during a session, to talk about county government than I did my own office. My office right now has 35 requests for special investigative audits, and those are primarily on cities and towns, and there are also a few school districts. Guess who is conspicuously not on that list? County government. I don't believe, or this is my hope. I don't think those people at the Capitol know everything I know about county government and what you go through. No other entity has to publish every one of their expenditures in a newspaper every month for the public to see. No other entity, those other entities aren't audited by the state auditor. They're audited by CPA firms who are in and out so fast. Now, I know some of you probably like to have some of those at times whenever you deal with us, but you're getting a fair shake with us. They don't have the surprise cash count that we go out and do on your county treasurer. And by the way, that's not just a surprise cash count. There are a lot of other procedures too to make sure every bit of money that is there, that is supposed to be there, is actually there. We're doing all of these monitorings, we do all of these trainings. Most of you have my cell phone, the manager's cell phone numbers, the supervisor's cell phone numbers. We are on speed dial to help you. You have been under so much scrutiny since 1978 that you barely had room to breathe. Now tell me how much transparency there is in your city governments and your school districts. Is there anybody in this room that believes they are more transparent and accountable than you? I don't either. And so when we talk about home rule, I know there are several options for home rule, but I think from my understanding, and I'm always open to hear what somebody wants to say, from my understanding, they want to move that more towards a city manager style of government and do away with the 3 county commissioner style of government. Now then, I'm quick to point out a couple of things, and these are things that you all need to have at the tip of your fingertips to be talking about. You all are a very humble group of people and you don't toot your horn like you should. County government mimics state government. Let's take the budgeting process, for instance. I now sit on the Board of Equalization as a member. And I'm going to admit it, I was a little bit nervous going from auditing only counties to the state level. And I get up here and I'm sitting in these meetings and I know this stuff. You want to know why? Because state government is like county government in all issues regarding the budget. Whenever you think about who's in charge of the county, you have your 3 county commissioners. Well, who do we have at the state level? We have the governor, the House, and the Senate. So we have 3 there, we have 3 here. Now I'm going to tell you where you're hurting yourself. And that's with the squabbles between the sheriffs and the commissioners. It's whenever you 8 elected officials don't always get along. And I might be a little bit preachy here because I think that you are selling yourselves short. You all do more for the constituents of this state than anyone else does. And you don't get the credit for it. And if you don't know your senator and your representative personally, a lot of that fault is yours. You've got to develop relationships. You've got to tell them what you're doing. Do you know there are some people who don't know that the treasurer is the one who collects the taxes and the assessor is the one who assesses the values and that all expenditures have to go through the clerk? They don't understand how segregated county government is by design. What have you done to educate those in charge in your area? Now, when we think about home rule, what they would do is the proposed legislation would say, put it to a vote of the people and let them decide what kind of government they want. Well, I believe if the people of Oklahoma knew everything I know about the segregation of duties in county government, and if they saw how many special investigative audits I do on cities and towns, there have been 105 in the last 3 years. How many scandals have we had in county government? We've had the salary issue. Well, I'm going to tell you something. That salary issue wasn't nearly as big as what some of my cities and towns investigative audits are. These are the talking points that you need to start talking about. Give yourself credit for what you do. Now, if this passes and it will change the Constitution. As I mentioned earlier, I jumped a step there. If this is passed, to put it to a vote of the people, and the majority of Oklahomans want to change this, then each county, the people in the county would have the ability to vote on this and change things. Now, I don't know about you, but everything I hear from taxpayers is they're angry. They're very angry because they don't know where their money's going, and it seems like government keeps taking more and more of it. We don't know what's going to happen in an election. Some of our very good officials aren't here today because they thought they were going to win the elections and they didn't quite make it. So there is no guaranteeing what will happen if this is put to a vote of the people. So I ask you, what do you believe in? Do you believe in county government Are you willing to get out here and educate people on what county government does versus other types of government? Because that weight is on you.
I think it's pretty clear. We have to learn more. We have to tell our stories. We have to be professional in every aspect of what we do in the counties. The goal of ACCO and the operating boards in ACCO is to try to make everybody have as much professional ability, whether it's through our vendors' advice or whether it's through our partners in the state. But telling our voice at home, because if we don't use our voice, somebody else is going to. So I think what Cindy says is spot on, and we all know it, and it's up to us to do it. I'm proud of the fact that I came from county government and I was an elected official. I know that we held it together and probably had the best return for tax dollars that the state can experience out there. We do a tremendous job. We hold it together with beer cans and paper clips and barbed wire sometimes, but we protect the public, and that's our role. We're about to finish up. Megan, hold your hand up. Megan is with Cindy's office, and she has a training brochure, not to say this negatively, but how to survive FEMA is how it's, and I think Traci is giving you a good outline that it isn't survival, it's working with it and making sure we're in compliance. We've run a little over our time. We appreciate, yes ma'am.
I just want to say this is not just about FEMA. This is going to be 3 hours, and OSU has graciously agreed to give you 3 hours of education credits. The first hour and a half is going to be on topics of county. It's going to affect your treasurer, your clerk, you commissioners, and the sheriff. I would encourage you to come to this, even if you only stay for the first hour and a half. The last hour and a half is going to be exactly what the person in your district barns who is preparing the paperwork needs to hear. We're going to go through some exercises, show them how easy the paperwork is. You really need this. You really need these things that we're going to be talking about, so I encourage you to attend.
Thank you. One last word, in continued pursuit of professionalism, we're putting together a breakout for the Dakota Conference in Tulsa with the Sheriff's Association. We're going to bring in information on establishing trust, how it can protect the counties, how it can improve the counties. So again, let's give these people a round of applause and thank them for their time, and we appreciate your attention.
Thank you.
Oh, outstanding.